I thought it might be a good idea to do some videos on King Lear. This is a text that we're studying for the second year of the English Literature A-level with edXL. The text that I'm using, or the version that I'm using, is the one that looks like that. It's the Oxford World Classics. It's a bit different to a lot of other versions because this one's based on the quarto, not the folio version. So it's based basically on a slightly earlier version of the text. There's marginal differences in terms of the play and its structure. The single biggest difference though is that this one is just in a collection of scenes. It's just scene 1 to scene 24, so it's not split into acts and then scenes. I will try and you know, when I'm talking through a scene, I'll try and explain where that is if you're looking at the folio version, but the line references and page references are to this edition. Before I started looking at it though, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the contextual factors really that feed into King Lear, the things that are really worth knowing before you actually start looking at the play. And I think the biggest thing to sort of start with is the fact that Shakespeare doesn't, you know, pluck this story out of the blue. It's based on a number of sources and you know, historical figures actually. You know, King Lear was based on a historical figure, but there was a play that was around, you know, kind of when Shakespeare was writing that he heavily based King Lear on, which was also called King Lear, but spelled L-E-I-R. A lot of the details of the plot are the same, but Shakespeare changes it a little bit. King Lear in the original version, or in the version that Shakespeare would have been familiar with, spoke very fondly of his wife. He was an old man who you know, got into the folly of the love test, but ultimately quite a kind-hearted, quite a noble man. And Shakespeare replaces that to a king who only mentions his wife once, and in that sense, when he does, actually he's talking about her in insulting terms, talking about the fact that his wife must have cheated on him if his daughters could be so unpleasant. So what Shakespeare does is he takes King Lear from, you know, a slightly foolish old man to somebody who actually represents a way of life, who is a misogynistic old feudal ruler, a guy who expects to be a ruler whatever he does because he's been divinely chosen. Shakespeare also adds in Gloucester and the whole Gloucester subplot, which is another old man who is very outdated, who can't keep up with the new world. He's taken in by his sons. He can't, you know, keep up with the world that he's in, and ultimately at the end his heart just sort of breaks and he dies, almost as though he's got no place in this world. So Shakespeare makes his version of King Lear much more about two different worlds rather than just about one man who makes a mistake. And I think that's really important because when he was writing, King James had you know, just sort of taken over as King of England. Quite an unpopular king in many ways after such a long stretch of Queen Elizabeth. He'd come down from Scotland and had united England and Scotland as a result. You know, he was already King of Scotland and had united the two. And so what Shakespeare's commenting on, I think, a little bit is the world that he's in at the time. Okay, this is a very, very heavily changing world, and Shakespeare's commenting on the old world and the new world that's kind of superseded it. The fact that it opens with the king splitting his country into three, or potentially splitting it into three, would have been seen as really pertinent at the time, because King James obviously just united, you know, he just made the United Kingdom, he just united England and Scotland. And there's one way of looking at this text, which is basically saying that Shakespeare's giving us a warning that we should follow King James and we should unite and we should do what he says. But equally, we've got a king in King Lear who is proud, who believes that he's divinely chosen, believes that he can't do any wrong, and clearly it's more problematic than that, because actually the message of the play can't possibly be follow the king come what may. And that carries on in all sorts of ways, because on the one hand, these characters who represent the old way of life are loyal, are good, are trusting, and are broadly trustworthy despite their many faults. While the younger characters, Goneril and Regan, are these scheming women. And Edmund is this very Machiavellian figure. Machiavellian comes from the name Machiavelli, who was an Italian philosopher whose views were incredibly controversial, and actually his text was banned in Shakespeare's time. He basically propounded the idea that you didn't have to almost be good and godly to succeed. You could actually be scheming and plot. It was very controversial at the time that Shakespeare was writing. And Shakespeare presents us with these younger characters who are happy to sort of take on those ways of life. So on the one hand, we've got the old guard who are misogynistic, who are flawed, who are naive, and a young guard who aren't. But then equally, these young characters are equally flawed because they're Machiavellian and they're scheming. That problem sort of continues because there's a big deal made in this play of the fact it's pre-Christian, it's set a long time ago. They talk about the gods, they talk about Jupiter, there's this real absence of a Christian god. Cordelia is linked with Christian terms. She's virtuous, her tears are like holy water, she's seen as very Christ-like, and yet at the end of the play it's her who's killed, who's sacrificed, who's like Jesus, sort of, you know, on the floor with Lear cradling her. So a religious interpretation doesn't work either. It's not about Shakespeare saying, look, these characters aren't religious, if you're Christian you'll be saved, because of course Cordelia isn't. So it's an incredibly problematic play. The old god are naive and are misogynistic and are foolish and are proud, but equally the young characters, you know, aren't particularly better. There are characters who are blamed for the lack of Christian values, but equally the character who is the most Christian is also sort of punished. So I think Shakespeare's deliberately creating a play here with no simple answers. Partly because, of course, he's got to support King James. James would watch his plays, but I think Shakespeare's also aware of the tensions and the problems and the fact that James wasn't universally popular. So before we look at it, I think those are the things that are really, really important to be aware of in terms of what was going on in Shakespeare's world.